Okay, this is chapter 6 and 7 of Where the Red Fern Grows. I'm going to make sure my sound is on. Okay, here we go. Okay. After the terrifying night, okay, so remember that there was a mountain lion that had kind of crawled around them, and his dogs were not acting very scared, especially the boy dog, okay? And he hasn't named them yet. That's a big thing here. After the terrifying night, the bright morning sun was a welcome sight. I fixed breakfast, and soon we were on our way. I tried to get the pups to follow me so as to lighten my load. They would for away, and then, sitting down on their rears, they would cry and whimper. Back in the sack they would go, with their heads sticking out of the holes and their long arms flopping. I moved on. About midday, I entered country I knew. I wasn't far from home. I dropped down out of the mountains into the bottoms, far above the place I had crossed the river on my way to town. Staying on the left of the river, I followed its course past several campgrounds, but didn't stop until I came to one where I had found the magazine. Here I took the pups out of the sack and sat down in the warm sand. As the afternoon wore on, I sat there deep in thought. I was trying to think of what I was going to tell my mother and father. Now remember, he's ran away from home, and he's been gone for probably at least 2 nights. I could think of nothing. Finally, I decided I would just tell them the truth, and with the help of my new overalls, cloth, and candy, I would weather the storm. My pups were having a big time playing. With their little front paws locked around each other, they were growling, rolling, and chewing on one another. They looked so cute. I laughed out loud. While I was watching their romping, the thought came, I haven't named them. I went over the list of names. For him, I tried Red, Bugle, Lead, name after name as before. For her, I tried Susie, Mabel, Queen, all kinds of girl names. None of them seemed to fit. Still mumbling names over and over, I glanced up. There, carved in the white bark of a sycamore tree, was a large heart. In the center of the heart were 2 names, Dan and Anne. The name Dan was a little larger than Anne. It was wide and bold. The scar stood out more. The name Anne was small, neat, and even. I stared, unbelieving, for there were my names. They were perfect. I walked over and picked up my dogs. Looking at him, I said, Your name is Dan. I'll call you Old Dan. Looking at her, I said, Your name is Little Anne. Your name, little girl, is Anne. I'll call you Little Anne. It was then that I realized it was all too perfect. Here in this fisherman's camp, I had found the magazine and the ad. I looked over at the old sycamore log. There I had asked God to help me get my 2 hound pups. There were my pups, rolling and playing in the warm sand. I thought of the old KC baking powder can and the fishermen, how freely they had given their nickels and dimes. I looked up again to their names carved in the tree. Yes, it was all there like a large puzzle. Piece by piece, each fit perfectly until the puzzle was complete. It could not have happened without the help of an unseen power. I stayed at the campground until dark. I knew I had to go home, but I had put it off as long as I could. The crying of the pups telling me they were hungry made up my mind for me. I knew the time had come for me to face my mother and father. I sacked up my dogs and waded the river. As I came out of the bottoms, I could see the lamplight glow from the windows of our home. One of the small yellow squares darkened for an instant. Someone had walked across the floor. I wondered who it was. I heard Daisy, our milk cow, moo. I was thinking so hard of what to say, it startled me for a second. Reaching the gate to our house, I stopped. I had never thought our home very pretty, but that night it looked different. It looked clean and neat and peaceful, nestled there in the foothills of the Ozark. Yes, on that night, I was proud it was of our home. My bare feet made no noise as I crossed the porch. With my free hand, I reached and pulled the lever that worked the latch. Slowly, the door swung inward. I couldn't see my father or my sisters. They were too far to the right of me, but my mother was directly in front of the door, sitting on her old cane-bottom rocker, knitting. She looked up. I saw the worry and grief leave her eyes. Her head bowed down. The knitting in her hands came up to cover her face. I stepped inside the room. I wanted to run to her and comfort her and tell her how sorry I was for all the worry and grief I had caused her. The booming voice of my father shook me from my trance. He said, Well, What have you got there?" Laughing, he got up from his chair and came over to me. He reached and took the sack from my shoulder. When we started looking for you," he said, "I went to the store and your grandpa told me all about it. It wasn't too hard to figure out what you had done, but you should have told us." I ran to my mother and, dropping to my knees, I buried my face in her lap. As Mama patted my head, I heard her say in a quavering voice, "Oh, why didn't you tell us? Why?" I couldn't answer. Between sobs, I heard the squeals of delight from my sisters as they fondled my pups. I heard my father say, "What's the other stuff you've got?" Without raising my head from my mother's lap, in a choking voice, I said, "One is for you, one is for Mama, and the other is for the girls." Now remember, he buys his mom and his dad stuff, and he buys his sister's candy. I heard the snapping of the string and the rattling of the paper. The oohs and ahs from my sisters were wonderful to hear. Papa came over to Mama. Laying the cloth on the arm of her chair, he said, "Well, we've been wanting a new dress. Here is enough cloth to make half a dozen dresses." Realizing that everything was forgiven, I stood up and dried my eyes. Papa was pleased with his new overalls. My sister got the pups for the candy. The light was shining from my mother's eyes as she fingered the cheap cotton cloth. Was something I'll never forget. Mama warmed some milk for the pups. They drank until their little tummies were tight and round. As I ate, Papa sat down at the table and started talking man talk to me. He asked, "How are things in town?" I told him it was boiling with people. The wagon yard was full of wagons and teams. He asked if I had seen anyone I knew. I told him I hadn't, but the station master had asked about him. He asked me where I'd spent the night. I told him about the cave in the Sparrow Hawk Mountains. He said that must have been the one called Robber's Cave. Now, there really is a Robber's Cave in Oklahoma. This would be a good time to think about looking that up. So that supposedly robbers would hide there. My youngest sister piped up, "Did you stay all night with some robbers?" My oldest sister said, "Silly, that was a long time ago. There aren't any robbers there now." The other one put her nickel's worth in. "Weren't you scared?" "No," I said. "I wasn't scared of staying in the cave, but I heard a mountain lion scream and it scared me half to death." "Aw, they won't bother you," Papa said. "You had a fire, didn't you?" "Yes," I said. He said, "They'll never bother you unless you are wounded or concerned. But if they are wounded or concerned,